kept the doors locked, not to keep others out, but to keep the screams from leaking into the city. That line was never written down. It was whispered once by a dying priest in 1903. A man who, after years of confession from the upper echelons of New York's elite, carried a secret so heavy it haunted his final breath. You see, between 1834 and 1867, on a narrow cobblestone stretch in lower Manhattan, there existed a place so vile, so cloaked in generational corruption, that most maps simply erased it. And the family who ran it, the Murphys, weren't just caretakers of that institution. They were architects of something much older and much darker. The Murphy family wasn't famous. They weren't rich by modern standards, but power, oh, they had that in spades, because their asylum, Murphy House for the Feeble and Deviant, wasn't built to heal. It was built to contain the unwanted truths of powerful men. This was not a hospital. It was a vault for human souls, a chamber where secrets were scrubbed clean with ice baths and electroshock, where inconvenient wives, bastard children, political liabilities, and whistleblowers were buried alive in silence. The public believed they were helping the mentally ill, but behind the iron doors, the Murphys were running experiments not just on bodies, but on memory, obedience, and spiritual surrender. Men in tailored coats would arrive in carriages at 3 a.m., dragging figures wrapped in bloodied linens, women who spoke out against their husbands, journalists who got too close to the truth, priests who questioned the bishop. They all disappeared into the Murphy walls, and no one asked questions, because those who did vanished. This was the real Manhattan Project before there was a Manhattan Project. But instead of physics, they studied what made a man break, what shattered the human mind, how to erase identity and write a new one in its place. They used methods now banned under every international law, but back then, there were no laws to protect the voiceless, and the Murphys, they weren't just torturing, they were refining something, feeding something. The deeper we go, the more you'll realize this wasn't just a family secret. It was a blueprint, one the institutions around you are still using today. Are you ready to descend? They say every building has a foundation, but the Murphy institution was built on something far older than stone. Before the asylum ever opened its doors, that land in lower Manhattan was sacred, not to us but to something ancient. The Lenape tribe once refused to tread that soil after sundown. They called it the mouth that remembers, a place where dreams turned inside out, where faces appeared in the trees, where those who entered alone often didn't return whole. In 1803, when the land was purchased by a shipping tycoon named Enoch Murphy, the records say he paid with coin, but the truth is, he offered something far more valuable. He offered his bloodline. It was Enoch's son, Thomas, who turned the land into a sanitarium. A beautiful word meant to sound safe, clean, sterile, but what Thomas created was a harvesting ground, not of crops, not of wealth, but of trauma. He believed pain could be turned into power, that fear could be distilled like a tincture and used to reprogram the human soul. And so he created floors, hidden below the visible structure, where no blueprints were ever drawn. Tunnels, chambers, iron doors carved with symbols that predate the English language. And when the first patients arrived, they weren't patients at all. They were experiments. You see, Thomas had been influenced by writings we're not supposed to have. Pages smuggled from crumbling cathedrals in southern Europe. Texts attributed to the Congregation of Ash, a vanished order believed to serve a darker Vatican beneath the Vatican. These texts spoke of resonance. That suffering, when done in specific chambers, under certain frequencies, didn't just break people, it opened something. And that's what the Murphy House became, not a hospital, but a gate, one that fed off confession, off helplessness, off silence, and now here's the truth that no historian will dare admit. Every major institution that came after the prisons, the psychiatric wards, the correctional academies, even military interrogation, black sites, all of them, copied this blueprint not because it healed, but because it worked. If you walked the Murphy halls at night and lived to remember it, the thing you'd never forget wasn't the screams, it was the absence of them. There were rooms, hundreds of them, with thick wooden doors and copper inlays. Inside those rooms there were people, but you wouldn't hear them cry. You'd hear something else, ticking, clicking, a rhythmic scraping like fingernails tracing circles on the walls. That's because the Murphys didn't just lock you away. They rewrote time inside your mind. Patients weren't treated. They were looped, subjected to routines so precise, so repetitive, that reality itself began to dissolve. Breakfast at 3 a.m., lights out at noon, solitary confinement for 16 hours, followed by 6 minutes of blinding opera music and flashing lights. Then silence again. They called it the cocoon protocol. The idea: break the ego, fragment memory, then flood the mind with manufactured truth. A prisoner would wake up not knowing his name, but knowing with absolute certainty that he'd been born in that room, that he deserved to be there. One man was recorded whispering to himself over and over, "My thoughts are not my own, my sins were planted." It worked terrifyingly well. Records show over 300 patients were discharged as reformed and placed into positions of obedience: school janitors, elevator operators, telephone switchboard clerks, roles where precision and silence were rewarded, roles that existed at the periphery of society, but always within earshot of secrets. The Murphys didn't just bury people, they deployed them. Imagine that for a second, a city where some of the calmest, most helpful faces you saw were programmed ghosts. In time, even law enforcement looked the other way. Why? Because Murphy House offered results. A crime family's black sheep, gone. A rival journalist, gone. A priest who knew too much, gone. In their place, calm, quiet obedience. The Murphy institution had cracked something ancient, a system of behavioral obliteration, and they knew that once the mind broke, the man could be replaced. That idea didn't die with them. It evolved. It wasn't just the patients they experimented on, it was the staff. Every nurse, every orderly, every guard who entered Murphy House had to undergo what was known as the sacrament of observation. A week-long trial before employment, where they were placed in the very cells they'd one day patrol, stripped of their identity, subjected to the same loops, the same forced routines. Most didn't make it. Some clawed at the walls until their fingernails split. Others begged to be released, only to be found, days later, grinning into mirrors, speaking backwards, or crying blood. But those who passed, they became something else. They weren't employees anymore, they were disciples, loyal beyond reason, capable of violence without question, and they were rewarded, not with money, but with knowledge. Access to forbidden texts, pages from manuals on emotional annihilation, whispered names of benefactors from overseas, private sermons held beneath the chapel in the lowest sublevel where no cross was ever hung. You need to understand something. This wasn't a hospital. It was a cult with a license to torture, and the city let it happen. In 1848, a young alderman raised concerns about the disappearances tied to the Murphy facility. Days later, his pregnant wife was committed for emotional imbalance. She never returned. He resigned, and the case went cold. That's the level of power we're talking about. But here's the question that haunts me. Why the rituals? Why the symbols, the mirrors, the strange incantations, the silence? Because the Murphys believed they weren't alone. They believed there was a force ancient, watching, that responded to suffering like a beacon. And if you fed it enough pain, it gave you control, not just over others, but over reality itself. How do I know? Because after the Murphys vanished in 1867, those symbols kept showing up in private boarding schools, in psychiatric institutions, in CAA documents from MKUltra, and the same phrase was always carved somewhere deep in the foundation: he who forgets himself can never be controlled. But what if they don't want you to forget? What if they want to replace you? Let me ask you something, and don't answer out loud. When was the last time you felt fully you? No distractions, no roles to play, just you, thinking your own thoughts. Most men can't answer that, because identity isn't something you have anymore. It's something that was given to you drip by drip, through repetition, punishment, and reward. That's what the Murphy house discovered. And that's what was stolen. See, the real legacy of the Murphy family wasn't the screams or the dead. It was the system they created, the template for obedience. A psychological machine that stripped a man down and built him back up in the shape of whatever authority needed. And now, over 150 years later, you're living in its shadow. Modern education, corporate structure, the justice system, the military, industrial complex, even digital platforms. They all speak the same language the Murphys did, just cleaner, faster, and cloaked in progress. Wake, work, numb, sleep, repeat, rewards when you comply, isolation when you question, and now you're here, watching this, because some part of you knows something's wrong, that you're not who you were supposed to become. And here's where the descent truly begins. Comment below, right now twice the phrase, the mask is breaking. Let the algorithm see you, let your former self hear you. This isn't about YouTube engagement. It's a declaration that you are no longer property of the system they built. You are a man, remembering, and now we go deeper, because the Murphys, they didn't disappear in 1867. They migrated, they rebranded, and they embedded themselves into the very agencies now teaching you how to think, feel, and believe. They never needed cages again. They found something better, a prison you can't see because it lives in your reflection. In 1868, a year after the Murphy Asylum was officially closed, following a mysterious fire, 5 new names appeared in the city records. Not Murphy, but Mayfair, Lawton, Harrow, Denslow, Creed. These names would go on to form the board of directors for a new organization, the American Institute for Behavioral Science Advancement. ABSA. It sounded harmless, scholarly, even progressive, but behind closed doors. It was just Murphy House with better PR, same methods, same doctrine, different uniforms, and now they had access to something the Murphys never did: federal funding. They used it to purchase land in upstate New York, built new facilities of white brick, clean halls, iron foundations beneath flower gardens, smiles at the front desk, trauma in the basement, but this time their test subjects weren't the poor or unwanted. They were volunteers, desperate men from the Civil War, women institutionalized for melancholia, immigrants who couldn't speak English. All told, they were being treated, but they were being rewritten. Early documentation shows patients injected with untested chemicals, subjected to forced silence for weeks, and asked one question over and over until they believed it. What did you forget? It wasn't therapy. It was deconstruction, you see. After years of trial and error, they had learned the core of control wasn't fear or pain, it was doubt. If you could make a man doubt his memory, you could replace it. And once that seed was planted, identity became malleable, like clay. That's what they were building now, not just obedience, but programmable human beings. The Murphy lineage didn't vanish. It fragmented into think tanks, intelligence agencies, and psychiatric boards, each carrying a piece of the old doctrine. And from the ashes of Murphy House came the blueprint for MKUltra. But we're not there yet. First, you need to understand how they learned to hack the soul. There was a file recovered in 1993, found in the flooded sublevels of the Denslow Institute, one of the Murphy offshoots. It was handwritten, pages sealed in wax. The cover bore no title, only a symbol, a circle with 2 intersecting lines and a downward triangle. Ancient, occult, pre-Christian. The first page was a confession. A scientist, or maybe a priest, it's unclear, admitting he had seen something he couldn't explain. Not in dreams, not in visions, but in the eyes of a patient. She'd been admitted for violent night terrors, But she didn't scream. She laughed so hard her jaw dislocated, and then she whispered something in a language no one understood. Over time, every doctor who treated her began to suffer. Paranoia, hallucinations, nightmares. One jumped from the 4th floor, claiming his reflection had tried to replace him. But one man, Dr. Solomon Renz, didn't run, he stayed, and he began to mirror her behaviors. Studying her language, mimicking her sleep cycles, inflicting the same cuts she did in the exact same places. He wrote that when he entered a deep trance beside her, he heard a voice, a female voice. Ageless, cold, it asked him a question: what would you give to never doubt again? He didn't answer, but after that day, he never blinked again. The patient vanished from the records, but Renz was promoted. He became the director of patient restructuring protocols. This is how deep the rabbit hole goes. This wasn't just psychology anymore. It was ritualized control, based on suffering, on trauma, on initiation. That's when the files begin referring to subjects not as patients, but as keys, because if broken the right way, a human being became a passcode. To what? We're about to find out. By 1872, the experiments had gone global. The Murphy descendants, now using new surnames, were embedding themselves into institutions in Europe, Prussia, Italy, France, even Vatican City. Wherever they went, one method followed: confessional structuring. The theory was this, that if you could get a man to confess something he feared and then punish him for it, his subconscious would fragment. It would comply in order to survive. They began creating false confession chambers. Rooms disguised as sanctuaries where subjects were told to unburden their souls. But the chambers were wired. Monks would listen. Priests would take notes. And the confessions were used against the subject in the next session. This created something terrifying, a man who feared his own truth. A man who over time would deny he ever said those words at all. That's what you are now seeing in modern times. Men terrified of their own thoughts, of their desires, of their instincts, programmed to distrust their impulses, to self-censor before anyone else even speaks. That's not an accident, that's design. From Murphy House to the church, from the church to the psychiatrist's office, from there to the HR department, and finally into your phone, where confession happens daily, in DMs, in Google searches. In posts you regret, and those confessions, they're being stored, because the system doesn't need to erase you anymore. It just needs to own the version of you it can control. The final phase of the Murphy doctrine wasn't destruction. It was duplication. Records from the 1880s show the creation of a covert program labeled Reflected Echo. Its goal, to create a second self inside a subject, a parallel persona, engineered through trauma, repetition, and emotional starvation. They succeeded. Patients subjected to 90-day isolation cycles were shown looping footage of themselves distorted, slowed, reversed, then fed back audio of their own voice, saying things they never remembered. Over time, those subjects began to respond to the false identity. They answered to new names. They adopted fictional memories. They confessed to crimes they didn't commit because they believed they had. The Murphy scientists called it the mirror body, a psychic double more loyal than the original, and once that double took root, the true self would collapse. This technology didn't end in secret labs. It made its way into entertainment. Children's programming, advertising, social media filters. You are now being shown distorted images of yourself daily, modified, beautified, mocked, or humiliated. And over time, you forget the original. You become Echo, and Echo is easy to program. There's a reason they want you confused, not just emotionally, but spiritually. Because a man in chaos is a man who can be guided. And the Murphy legacy, the true undying shadow of that institution, is not in books or old buildings. It's in the systems that teach you to forget who you are. It's in the jobs that punish your rebellion. The schools that reward memorization, not creation. The relationships where love must be earned, not given. It's in every algorithm that watches what you desire, then punishes you for it with shame, comparison, or silence. This isn't conspiracy, this is continuity. The Murphy house was never burned down, it was replicated in every prison, every rehab, every wellness retreat, designed to remove your edge and sell it back to you as peace. But here's the twist. If this system can break men, then it can also be reversed. That's what the rest of this descent is for. Not to terrify you, but to arm you, because the truth doesn't just set you free, it rebuilds you. And now we go beneath the asylum, where the rituals began, and the blood never dried. Beneath the Murphy asylum, there were 7 sublevels. Only 2 were listed in official records. The rest sealed, forgotten until 1896, when a group of engineers working on early subway lines accidentally breached the 4th level. What they found was not medical, no beds, no restraints, no patients. Only a stone room 20 feet wide lined with iron mirrors, and at its center a chair facing nothing, no windows, no symbols, just silence. Etched into the stone above it, obedience is the highest memory. The engineers weren't allowed to speak about what they saw. Most didn't live long enough to try, but a journal survived hidden in a wall for nearly a century. One of the workers wrote that when they stood in the room, time stopped, not metaphorically, literally. They said the air had weight, like standing inside someone's breath, and when they looked into the mirrors, they didn't see themselves. They saw choices they had never made. The room was later identified in classified documents as Chamber Epsilon. Its purpose to overwrite fate. The Murphys believed that identity was not just programmable, it was negotiable, that if you could fracture time inside a human mind, you could rewrite his origin. Chamber Epsilon wasn't just torture. It was a forge. They built men in that room, new memories, new loyalties, new gods, and that technology, make no mistake, didn't die in the 1800s. It was adopted by think tanks, military contractors, religious schools, any institution that wanted to reshape identity at the root. That's why today you feel distant from your childhood, numb to your own memories, unsure of who you were before the world named you. Because they're still using mirrors, just digital now. You ever wonder why mirrors feel off? Why sometimes, when you catch your reflection, you feel like you're looking at a stranger? The Murphys had a term for this. Split echo syndrome. It's when a person's internal self fractures from the external performance. It starts with small things, a forced smile, a suppressed truth, a job that pays you to lie, a relationship where you shrink to fit. Each time, a piece of you detaches, and the mirror it remembers. That's why Murphy facilities were filled with reflective surfaces, not for vanity, but for tracking fragmentation. Guards were trained to log changes in facial behavior when patients looked into mirrors and didn't blink. When they stared too long, when they smiled too fast, because those were signs. Signs the original self was slipping, and the new program was embedding. Today, they don't need a dark basement. You carry the mirror in your pocket. Front-facing cameras, filtered selfies, scrolling for identity. Every day you're told to be yourself. But what they mean is, be your reflection. Be the version that wins approval, that conforms, that aligns. And the more you perform, the more distant the original becomes, until one day you look in the mirror and whisper, I don't remember who I was before this. That's the point, not to control you, but to erase the part of you that can't be. Let's go deeper now to the 6th sublevel of the Murphy compound. No records exist of it, only stories. A maintenance worker in 1900, one claimed he was sent down with 2 others to inspect a foundation leak. Only one returned. He refused to speak except to scribble 2 words on his shirt before being committed. They watch. Here's what we believe. The 6th sublevel wasn't man-made, it was carved. Smooth, unnatural stone. Blacker than coal. Cold no matter the temperature above. In the center was an altar. Around it concentric rings of ash and bone, and on the walls, language no scholar has ever translated, but they keep showing up. In deep-sea ruins off the coast of Malta, in hidden pages of the Codex Gigas, and on the stained glass windows of certain cathedrals where the Jesuit order held influence, the Murphys didn't invent control. They inherited it from something older, something that doesn't speak, but listens, and that's the darkest truth of all. What if the system isn't broken? What if it was never meant to be fair? What if it was built to feed something else? Something that's always been here and isn't done. By the time the Murphy bloodline vanished in the late 19th century, they were no longer a family, they were a network, hidden in plain sight, embedded in boards, councils, trusts, and charitable foundations. But their greatest achievement wasn't a facility, it was an idea, manufactured consent, the notion that if you could saturate a man's environment with a single message, he would believe it not because it was true, but because it was everywhere. They started with newspapers, leaked fake quotes, false medical studies, emotional stories about how the Murphy Institute had saved poor children from madness. None of it was real, but the headlines repeated. And when something is repeated long enough, it becomes truth by fatigue. Modern media did not invent propaganda. They simply digitized the Murphy doctrine, and now you live inside it. The opinions you think are yours, how many were chosen for you? The news you consume, how often do you verify it? The products you buy, the pills you swallow, the content you scroll, all of it. Selected, shaped, and sold before you had a chance to ask why. Because that's the system now. Not brutal, but subtle, not violent, but inevitable, the Murphy Project never died. It evolved into something far more dangerous, a society where no one knows they're in a cage, because the walls are made of agreement. Here's the part no one likes to hear. The Murphy Institution didn't create obedience. It revealed how desperately we crave it. Because freedom is terrifying, it requires choices, responsibility, accountability. But obedience, that's easy. It's warm, familiar, padded with validation. Most men don't want to think. They want to be told what to think and then be applauded for repeating it. The Murphy system understood this perfectly. So they offered obedience as medicine, disobedience, diagnosed, non-compliance, pathologized, anger, labeled toxic, despair, labeled depression, and medicated into numbness. But what if that pain was sacred? What if it was your soul trying to break through the programming? You were never meant to be docile. You were meant to choose, and every time you silence that choice, every time you suppress the roar inside, another layer of chains is forged. The Murphy house is gone, yes, but its successor is you. Every time you censor yourself, every time you choose silence over truth, every time you obey what you know is wrong, you rebuild their walls, and the only way out is to remember who you were before the mirrors, before the programming, before they taught you to fear your own power. Now breathe, because next, we go to the place where even the Murphys feared to look. Where the voice behind the mirror lives and what it wants, there is one symbol that shows up everywhere in Murphy-related texts, even centuries before their asylum opened, a triangle inside a circle with a black dot at its center. You'll find it etched into old Bibles, hidden under paint on monastery walls, even carved into the cornerstones of Ivy League schools. The Murphys called it the eye beneath, not to be confused with the eye of providence, the all-seeing eye of God. No, this was the eye that looked up from below. The eye beneath didn't observe, it remembered. It was said that in the deepest sublevel of the Murphy asylum, there was a chamber known only as the still room. No doors, no light, just polished obsidian floors, and that symbol burned into the center. One doctor who entered as part of an inspection team was found 4 hours later, kneeling, mouth sewn shut. Smiling, he had written one phrase in chalk over and over on the walls. It saw me. Here's where it gets worse. A fragment of Murphy correspondence intercepted in 1903 by a British occultist named Ernest Crowley claimed that the eye beneath was not metaphor. It was real, and it could only see those who had no name, those whose identity had been scrubbed, broken, shattered until nothing was left but silence. That's the ultimate goal of all this, isn't it? To erase the name you gave yourself and leave only the name they choose for you, because once the original self is gone, you can be watched fully, internally, without resistance, ever feel like something's watching you. Even when you're alone, that's not paranoia, it's memory. See, the Murphys believed that the soul wasn't just spiritual, it was recordable, not in data, but in pattern. They theorized and later proved that after enough psychological loops, the human brain would continue repeating its trauma, even without external input, like a machine stuck in playback mode. This became known in their doctrine as residual self-control. In plain words, they break you once and you do the rest. Every time you double, check what you said. Every time you feel guilt without knowing why. Every time you dream of running but wake up standing still. That's not weakness. That's residue, a psychic scar shaped like the cage you escaped from. And the worst part, most men protect it because they mistake it for discipline, for morality, for conscience. But it's not. It's programming. The Murphy system understood that freedom was fragile. So instead of chasing rebels, they built a world where rebels police themselves. And the bars, they're in your beliefs, that you're not good enough, not smart enough, not worthy of breaking free. None of that is real. It was installed. The question is, how much of you is truly yours? Let me tell you about the choir, not music, not singing, but 12 individuals, anonymous, untraceable, who operated in the final days of the Murphy house, believed to be its highest-ranking architects, each one selected for their lack of family, origin, or identity, chosen not for what they had, but for what they lacked, because that's the secret ingredient in elite psychological control: emptiness. Not pain, not evil, just the absence of self. The choir wore no uniforms, carried no IDs, didn't speak unless commanded. They performed what the Murphy texts called pattern insertions, rituals where new identities were implanted into broken subjects through sound, repetition, and deprivation. They'd stand in the subject's room for hours, saying nothing, breathing in sync, then one word repeated over and over: obey, trust, forget. Eventually, the subject would respond without understanding why. They weren't hypnotized, they were downloaded. Today, this has evolved. You hear it in advertising, in political slogans, in influencer mantras. It's not just language, it's pattern hacking, because repetition isn't just for remembering, it's for replacing. If they say it often enough, and you hear it tired enough, it becomes your truth. In 1911, a fire burned down a building in Buffalo, New York. Officials called it a housing accident. But survivors told a different story. They said there were no beds inside, only chairs, facing screens, static, flashes, loops of people screaming, no sound, just visuals repeated over and over. Some of those survivors were children. They never grew up normal. They either vanished or joined institutions. One became head of psychiatric operations at a major U.S. military base. Another was photographed attending the first meeting of Tavistock. If you've never heard of Tavistock, look deeper. They took the Murphy blueprint and globalized it. Mass trauma through media, war, pandemics, terror, constant input. No resolution. It's not to scare you. It's to shatter you, because shattered minds don't resist. They absorb, and the secret, once you're overwhelmed long enough, you choose the cage, because it feels safer than the unknown. That's the end game, not to enslave you, but to make you volunteer. Let me tell you a final truth, one that may break something inside you. The Murphy Project succeeded, not in 1834, not in 1867, but right now, because you are living inside its echo. Its ideas are law, its tools are apps, its rooms are everywhere. The man who questions too much, labeled unstable. The woman who doesn't conform, diagnosed. The child who resists structure, medicated. And the one who sees it all, silenced, but the system doesn't need to stop you. It just needs to delay you until you're too tired to fight, too broke to rebuild, too distracted to remember who you were. But if you're still watching this, you haven't forgotten, not completely. That flicker inside, that resistance, that's what they fear most. Not rebellion, but memory, because memory leads to identity, and identity leads to power. And now, we dig deeper into the machinery beneath your daily life, the wires behind the screen, the code written in you, and how to break it.